third time. Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf Mem Zayin. This month's learning is sponsored by CSEK for the Refuah Shlema of Sharona Rachel Bat Miriam Chana. And today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island for Refuah Shlema for Gittin Rivka Bat Golda Mariam. Shlema. Okay, we are going to a few quick announcements. Reminder that anyone who joins the Zoom is taking a break Tuesday until and including next Tuesday for a week. Then we'll be back on Wednesday for a few more days before I go away a second time. And the Shiurim will be up as usual. They'll be up earlier. So if you're living in the States or somewhere where the time zone is much earlier, you'll be seeing the post going up much earlier than usual. You'll get confused. It's at nighttime, even though it's really the next day for some other people. So they'll be up at 5:30 in the morning Israel time. So anyone who wants to get up early and listen or listen the night before can do that. That'll be for the next week or so. Another announcement, the bookmarks are getting going. And anyone who wants to sponsor bookmarks, we have a few sponsored already. Anyone who wants to, it's $500 per bookmark. I believe it's 1,800 shekels. If somebody wants to sponsor, the bookmarks again have musagim on them, and they take a lot of time to put together with the writing and the editing and then the printing. So it basically helps cover the costs of that and mailing them out. And then, other people are did I say the wrong thing? Seder Nizikin, thank you. The bookmarks for Seder Nizikin. Okay, Seder Nizikin, we're starting already in November, Bezrat Hashem. So we're getting ready early and doing bookmarks for that. Okay. One final announcement. I've been recording the summer dapim in advance. So again, that means I've mentioned to people dedications will be in writing only, not in, I won't be announcing them over the summer unless you got them in early enough, and then I did. And also I realized that in terms of the details for the siyum, that's coming up in August, I won't really be announcing it in the shiur so much because I recorded most of them in advance. So just know that about 2 weeks probably before the siyum, the registration will go up as usual, and you can register to come. There's a siyum live in Atlantic Beach and in New York. Anyone who's around is invited to come, and the details will all be up on the details and a way you can always just email us if you need more details. We'll be there, but that siyum will be on Zoom, so we'll have the same. It'll just be a bit of a different style of a Zoom siyum, but we'll have a Zoom siyum. It'll be on August, just so you have the details, August 13th on a Sunday at 1:30 in the afternoon in America, and which will be 8:30 in Israel. And wherever you are, it's around the same time that we always do it. So it should be your usual slot, and that's the siyum, and it will all go up online after as usual. So that's just details to know in advance. And with that, let's get started with our daf. We had the Mishnah that said if you sell yourself into slavery, okay, and we're going to get to a bunch of stories where people sold themselves to be a slave to Gentiles, and then we're going to get into ludaim. Okay, ludaim, some people think of cannibals, some people think are selling yourself to be a gladiator, and you can read up on Flashback this week. Julie Mishkin wrote all about gladiators and the kind of the history behind that. So we start with a story. So basically the Mishnah had said, if you do it, we don't redeem you because we don't want to encourage people to do this because, well, it's kind of dangerous, and it's not, we don't want Jews selling themselves to be slaves to Gentiles. It makes it very difficult to retain your Jewish, right? Just like we didn't want us selling our slaves to Gentiles, we certainly don't want us selling ourselves. However, we modified it a little bit by saying it's only if they continually do it. In the beginning, we do redeem them because in the end, we really don't want them to be there. But if someone keeps doing this, right, they're basically just trying to get the community to give him money, because what are they doing, right? He'll sell himself, he'll get the money, and then people will redeem him and he'll end up with money. So we definitely want to discourage that. So if they've done it a bunch of times, we're not going to allow this. Now we have two stories, two very different stories. So this guy sold himself to the ludaim, again, either cannibals or to be a gladiator. He comes in front of Rabbi Ami. Amar le Pirkan. He says, please redeem me. Amar. So now most people take out the word lay. Okay, it doesn't say lay. He says, meaning says to the people around him, says to himself, starts thinking it through. Tanan, it says in the Mishnah, you sell yourself or he sells his sons to be slaves. We don't redeem them. But we do save the sons, and it really should be after their fathers die, because we're worried, right? That the Mishnah had also said, I forgot to reread that part, but why? Because we're worried about kilkula, we're worried about them losing their Jewish identity. Here, this is a life and death matter. That's even more severe than losing your religion. Here, they might die, again, either because it's a gladiator or because they're going to eat him, cannibals. Rabban and Rabbi Elazar. So the rabbis come to Rabbi Ami and say, you're going to redeem this guy? This guy is not Jewish anymore. He left the religion. Okay, he's a heretic or whatever, right? He's one of these categories of people. He stopped being Jewish. Don't redeem him. Now, it's interesting because even if you leave the Jewish religion, you're still considered Jewish, but they're basically saying, we don't have to redeem this person. How do we know this? We see him eating non-kosher food. Maybe he's just eating it because he likes it better, or because he can't afford the kosher meat is so expensive. Maybe it's not, there's two ways of eating, and this comes up in a whole bunch of other studios. We'll see it in Sanhedrin, we'll see it in other places. There's a difference between somebody who eats non-kosher or doesn't, and this obviously extends to anything, who doesn't keep mitzvot because it's just more convenient not to keep mitzvot, but still believes in God, or rejects Judaism entirely, right? And then they're doing it because they don't want to be Jewish. So Amrule, so they said to him, but we've seen him at a table where there's kosher food and non-kosher food, and he ignores the kosher food and eats the non-kosher food. Now, this, by the way, is a play on lo shavik inish hetera va'achilisura. There's a principle that the average person, if both are right in front of him, he's not or her, she's not going to take the isser instead of the heter. And this is saying this guy did the exact opposite. So he clearly indicated that doesn't want to be part of the Jewish religion. Amarle, zilo kashav kalida farkina. So in the end, Rabbi Ami kind of lifts up his hands and says, well, I guess you're right. And then he goes to the person, and as the rabbis convinced him, so he goes to the person, that's the Amarle, zil, go, meaning leave me alone, lo kashav kelachti farkina. I don't have a way to redeem you, sorry. Okay, and if you look, the Koran has a good footnote about the halacha here. I didn't get to look it up, that's why I'm quoting it for the Koran's footnote, but they say, and this is very interesting, there's a distinction. If somebody leaves the religion, right, and basically decides not to be part of the Jewish religion on purpose, intentionally, so then we are not allowed to redeem them. Because Rabbi Ami really wanted to, and obviously if he was allowed to, he would have done it anyway. It's against the rules to be able to do this. However, if they're at an in-between stage where they did it l'te'avam, so he says there's no obligation, but I just want to make sure I'm quoting this right, that according to the halacha, there's no obligation, but you can. However, the interesting part to me, and this again, like I don't always have time to do this, but it requires more research. But he says here, one second. Right, so the Beit Yosef infers from the statement of the Rambam that even though it's not forbidden to redeem him, it's not forbidden, but you're not required to. However, he says that the later commentaries rule that one is obligated to redeem such a person. So what I thought was interesting is what changed. That if you have someone who's just not really keeping religion, but they do believe in being Jewish, then you're actually required to redeem, which is very interesting. That changed. It's a very interesting approach. I just spent the Shabbat with Harav Malamed in Har Bracha. He just came out with a book on Giur, on conversion. Fascinating book. All the tshuvot of I don't know all, but many, they gathered many tshuvot. I think about 700, they said. They weren't sure exactly, but around 700 tshuvot in the last 150 years about conversion. And the whole thing was about this. What does it mean to accept mitzvot? Even if you say converts need to accept mitzvot, what does it mean to accept mitzvot? Just wanting to be part of the Jewish people. Their claim is that most of the poskim really do side on the fact that you might need Kabbalat mitzvot. The question is, what does Kabbalat mitzvot mean? What does it mean, and how much do we need you to actually be keeping, or just wanting to be part of the Jewish people might be enough to be considered acceptance of mitzvot? Fascinating I mean, it's a huge book. It's 600 or more, maybe even more pages. And but all sorts of interesting halakhic issues, kind of in bite-sized pieces, and kind of connecting with the sugiyot, but making it very clear. It's all in Hebrew. But it's very interesting that this book came out, and really the goal is to try to affect change in this area. So I thought about it just because it's similar to what we're talking about. Anyway, let's go on. Reish Lakish, Zabin Nafshe Leludai. Another story, but with a very different ending. Reish Lakish sold himself to the Ludaim. Now, Reish Lakish has an interesting story. He, if you remember, was a listim. He was a bandit. And he ends up, Rabbi Yochanan, he tries to kind of dive into the water, seeing Rabbi Yochanan's beauty, thinking he's a woman. Rabbi Yochanan brings him to become part of the learning world. He says, wow, you have great passion. Let's put it toward Torah. And Reish Lakish basically sort of does tshuva and becomes a big Talmid Chacham. Tosfot claims that this must have been before he goes bad, because why else would he be, once he was already, before he leaves his bad life, so to speak, because once he was in the Beit Midrash, why on earth would he sell himself to these, either, again, to be a gladiator or to cannibals? Anyway, here's the story. Shaka b'hadei chayata v'galgalta. So now he takes the law into his own hands. He doesn't rely on anybody, which makes sense. He was a bandit. He knew how to do things. He says, okay, he took in his hands a bag, some sort of bag, with a little bag with either a ball or a rock, depending on the translation you go by. Amar gemire diyoma batra kol dibayim minayu avdele. It's a known thing. Let's just assume they're cannibals. That on the last day before they eat you, they give you your final. They say, what's your final request? We'll do anything you want before we kill you. For what reason? Well, in order to be. Now Rashi says this is in order so that you'll kind of say, oh, it's okay that you kill me, because you'll feel like at least you got your last request. I don't know why they care about you. Some people say it makes their blood sweeter. It's going to make your blood sweeter if you are in a good mood before, and therefore you'll taste better. I never tried that, but maybe that's one. So yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I said that clearly, but yes, you'll forgive them for killing you because you'll be in good spirits. That was the first one. And the second is that your blood will be sweeter. In any case, this was a thing that they granted you your final request. So Yoma Batra Amule, he says to them, they say to him, what would you like? Amar lehu, I want to tie you up and sit you down. Each one of you, I'll give you a little hit, 1.5 hits from my little bag here. Now, some people say they didn't realize he had a rock or hard ball in there. Okay, it was very small, and they didn't realize what he was up to. They thought, okay, you'll hit us with your little bag. Okay, what's the big deal? I mean, it wasn't the smartest thing to have him tie them up and sit them down, but somehow I guess they weren't so smart. Kamtinu v'utvinu, so he ties them up, sits them down. Now here again, there's different translations. I'll go with the one that seemed to me to make the most sense. But again, they all kind of make sense in a certain way. I'm just going to keep it simple here. Each one, he would hit them one hit, and he would die. Okay, some people think they didn't necessarily die right away. They just got weaker, but let's just go with he died. So Reish Lakish would make this face like he was angry at them. What are you mocking me? Now, why did he do this? He wanted them to think that the person was still alive. So he kind of looked like angry at them. What, are you laughing at me? You're making fun of me, as if like the other people would think that the person's still alive. And in that way, right? And then he continued to say, I only hit you once. I still have another half to hit you. So don't make fun of me. I'm going to hit you again. And in that way, katlinu kulu nafik ba'at. Okay, so he kills them all, and then he goes out. This next section, how exactly it's connected and what's going on, is a good question. Again, it can be read in different ways. That nafik ba'at, we're done, and now we're moving on to something else about Reish Lakish. Or he goes out, yativ ka'acha v'shate, he goes and he eats and drinks, but it seems like it's probably later and not talking about right away. Amrle barte. So basically, the way the commentaries understand this, ka'acha v'shate, at least some of the commentaries, that but you can look at Rashi, he says, Kol yamav kol ma shayam mistakel lo hayam etzamsem latzniya liyom echad. His theory in life, perhaps it was a reaction to this incident, that he almost lost his life, perhaps not, unclear, but but it sounds like every day he would eat and drink. He would put all his money into his food, or it could be just whatever he needed. He didn't save money. This was an approach of his to life. He didn't save up. So his daughter says to him, Amar lebarte, lo bayit midi l'misgale, do you not need anything to lie on? Which, again, the Rashi Tosfot seemed to think that they would sleep, and that he didn't sleep with a pillow. And that's what she was saying. I actually thought, I didn't see anyone who said this, but again, I didn't do a thorough research. It seems like, do you not need anything to rely on? Like, meaning, don't you need money to keep in your savings account? To which he answers, Sarah Amarle, biti crazy kare. This is why the commentators, Rashi and Tosfot, go this way. My stomach is my pillow. In other words, I don't need a pillow because my stomach's fat enough that it kind of works as my pillow. Again, it could be more what I have in my stomach is what, in other words, that's my savings. I save it up in my stomach. Worst case, I don't have food the next day. I ate a lot today. I'm good. Unclear exactly if this connects or doesn't connect to the previous. But the idea is that he lived on not a lot. And you're going to see this again. When he died, he left one kav of saffron. He said about himself, this is a pasuk talking about foolish people who basically save up their money and leave their money to others. In other words, all their hard work just goes to other people. And his idea was, there's no point to save and give money to your children, right? Some, in fact, many might disagree with this, but his attitude was use your money up in your life and use it for yourself to benefit from. And there's no point to leaving money in this world. And he was upset at himself that he left over this kav of saffron. He would have preferred to have completed everything that he had. Okay, why this is here, not so clear. Anyway, we're moving on to the next Mishnah. Okay, there's at least 3 different interpretations of this Mishnah. We'll go with 2. Someone who sells his field to a Gentile, he himself, the person who sold it, or she herself, has to buy the produce from the field, the bikurim, the first fruits, from the Gentile, because of tikkun olam. That's the first reading, which means that if I sold my field to a Gentile, my responsibility for tikkun olam is that I have to buy back the bikurim, which could be they'll sell to me for a large amount of money because they know I'm desperate to get this because the law is I have to do it, which is basically a deterrent for me to sell my land to a Gentile. Right? Why would I do that if every year I'm going to have to spend a lot of money to get the bikurim back? So the whole idea here, according to both takana, really is to prevent people from selling land to Gentiles. The second version just gets rid of the vav. Okay, instead of lokech umevi, which basically means I have to buy and bring, me, the seller, is if I sell my field to a Gentile, someone who buys the fruits from the Gentile, lokech mevi mimenu bikurim, meaning there's a third person here. There's me, I sold it to the Gentile. Then there's you who comes along and buys the fruits for the Gentile. Well, when you go buy those fruits, you're going to have to bring bikurim on them, which basically is going to be a deterrent for you to buy fruits from this Gentile, because why would you, right? You go to the shuk, there's 10 different stalls, you'll buy from a different guy who basically didn't take land that was Jewish land. And then basically this is a boycott. They're going to boycott this person's stall. This person won't have anyone to buy from. Now, according to this interpretation, you'd have to say the majority of the people there are Jewish and Jews who are keeping the rules, because otherwise this boycott won't really help. So if the majority of people are Jews and nobody buys the fruits from this, or the produce from this field, well, the person in the end is not going to want to keep the field and they'll sell it back to Jews because it's just not worth their while. So again, a deterrent to make sure that lands aren't kept. Again, we're obviously talking about land in Israel because bikurim are only in Israel. Land in Israel, we want to basically make sure that as much land as possible is in the hand of Jews. That's what the purpose of this tikkun olam is. So Amar Rabba. Right now we're going to, okay. Gemara starts off in a totally different place, although it's not totally different, but right now we're not directly linking it to our Gemara, or our Mishnah, not linking it to our Mishnah. What we're going to have now is a machloket between Rabba and Rabbi Elazar, and then we're going to have a proof Rabba is going to bring from his tannaitic source. We're going to reject it. Then we're going to have 3 proofs that could be potentially brought to prove Rabbi Elazar's side. One of them is our Mishnah, okay, and that's how we're going to get back to our Mishnah. And then we're going to reject all of the attempts to prove Rabbi Elazar. We're going to be left with no clear, again, when we take a source and we try to use it to prove one side, and then we say, well, the source could be understood a different way, it means that it's inconclusive. We can't use it as a definite proof. It could, but might not. So Amar Rabba, they now have this big machloket about land that's sold to Gentiles in Israel and what its status is when it comes to two issues. One is the mitzvot that are dependent on the land, and the other is being able to destroy the land in some way, even if you're doing something productive from it, but you're kind of ruining the land. So let's read, and each one's going to say one yes, one no. Okay, they're going to have the opposite approaches in both. Amar Rabba, אף על פי שאין קניין לעובד כוכבים בארץ ישראל להכיר מידי מעשר, שנאמר כי לי הארץ, לי קדושת הארץ, even though, and the second part of this we'll only get to soon. First, let's get what the even though is. Even though, when you sell your land to a Gentile, the kinyan, when he acquires it or she acquires it, it doesn't have the power to remove the mitzvot that are dependent on the land. What does that mean? Well, they're not going to keep the land, the mitzvot, and do the tithes and all that. But it means that if one of us were to purchase produce from them, now, when you have produce, when are you obligated in the tithings? When you make a pile and then you kind of flatten the pile at the top, that's called Gemar Malacha. If the Gemar Malacha stage, meaning the completion of the work, is the end of this pile that you have, and then you bring it into your house. If you do, but bring it into your house is not enough. If I bought it in the shuk and brought it into my house and it was in the hands of a Gentile, then I definitely don't have to bring the tithes. But if I made the pile in my while it was in my possession, I bought a whole bunch, I made a big pile, then I brought it into my house, I'd be obligated in tithes according to Rabba. Okay, because the fact that it grew in the ownership of a Gentile doesn't make a difference. Okay, that doesn't have the power to remove the sanctity of the land is on it. So if I do what we call Gemar Malacha, and then I bring it into my house, I'm obligated to do the tithes. And that's because it says Ki li haaretz, the land is mine, which is God, and that means the land is sanctified. Doesn't matter who owns it. Aval, so now this was even though this is the case, on a different issue, yesh kinyan la'ovei kochavim be'eretz Yisrael lachpor ba borot shechinu ma'arot. But when it comes, if they do acquire it in the sense that they can dig wells, they can dig a cave, they can dig different ditches, okay, that's not called ruining the land, even though theoretically it is ruining the land, but it's okay. Shenemar shamayim shamayim la'Hashem. Heavens are God's, ba'aretz natan l'bnei adam, but land was given to humans, so that their rights of acquiring don't change the issue of kedushat haaretz. Okay, that's still there, but they do have a certain type of acquiring over it that they can do with it what they want. Rabbi Elazar is going to say the exact opposite. Rabbi Elazar omer, so if I buy it and it grew in the property of the Gentile, I'm not obligated to tithe the produce, even if I made the pile and then brought it into my house. Shene'emal, Pasuk says, Reshit digancha, the first of your grains. Below digan ovei kochavim, this wasn't my grains. I didn't grow them. It's who grows them that makes it obligated. Aval, ein kinyan lovei kochavim be'eretz Yisrael lachpor ba'borot shechinu ma'arot shene'emar la'Hashem haaretz, because it says in a pasuk that the land is God's, and therefore, since the land is God's, right, they can't just do with it what they want. So opposite approach. The second machloket we're really not going to get into. The issue that we're going to get into is there a kinyan for the ovei kochavim la'afkia, to uproot the whole issue of tithes, which is the second opinion, or the first opinion that there isn't, right? The kedusha is still there, so if I purchase it and do Gemar Malacha, I have to do the master. What's the root of the machloket? Mar savar, so this we already saw. The second opinion says, digancha v'lo digan ovei kochavim. It has to be yours in your ownership. It grew in your possession, and this didn't, so you're not obligated. Umar savar, the Rabba holds, digunecha v'lo digun ovei kochavim. Dagan, he understands digancha, not as your grains, but digunecha. Digun is the process of making the pile and flattening it out. That's the digun. So he says it's the diguncha that's what's important. As long as you do the digun, the making the pile, then already you're obligated. In the maaser, it doesn't matter how it grew. So it's two different ways of understanding what this word digancha means. Does it mean your grains? Does it mean the action of turning it into grain, which basically means you've finished it, you've completed it. So if you complete it, you're obligated. So now we're going to start getting into the proofs. We're going to have one for Rabba, as I said, and three for Rabbi Elazar. The one for Rabba is Rabba himself talking. The one for Rabbi Elazar is the Gemara talking for Rabbi Elazar. But Amar Rabba, mina minala. What's my proof? The Mishnah says, a different Mishnah. If you have leket, shechar peah, those are the things you leave in the field for the poor people, that belongs to a Gentile, it's obligated in tithing, unless elim ken hifkir, unless he made it ownerless. Now, there's a lot of things not clear here, a lot of details missing. Whose field, who took the leket, who was mafkir, we don't know any of this yet, so they're going to try to figure out. What's the case? If it's a Jew, a Jewish land that they did leket, they left the leket shechan peh on their fields for the poor people, and came along a Gentile, collected it, and then, now what's the chayav v'maaser? You would have to have, and then he sold it in the shuk to somebody else, and it was a lot, and they made the pile, they be chayav v'maaser. So the buyer, the purchaser from the Gentile would have to do the maaser, and can't hifkir, unless, now, who is mafkir? Unless the Jew in the beginning made his field ownerless, to which they say that can't possibly be. What are matanot aniyim leket shechan peah? These are things you leave in your field for the poor people, which means you make them ownerless. As soon as you leave them, they're ownerless. So they're already ownerless. So there's no such thing as the Jew later making it ownerless. That makes absolutely no sense. Only if they made it ownerless, the whole definition of leket shechan peah are items that you made ownerless. It's things you left in the field, you left a bundle or two behind, you forgot it. Okay, either you dropped it and didn't pay attention, you dropped it and then, or you forgot it there, or it's the corner of your field you leave over. All those things by definition are ownerless by the Jew. So that can't be. So they say, it must be the oved kochavim. Now this is interesting to think. Then the oved kochavim, first of all, it's interesting in general. Number one, that you could leave leket shechan peah as a Jew and the Gentile can collect it. That was the first option. Now, you think maybe it was only left for Jews, but no, it was Gentiles could take it also, it seems, at least according to that option. Then we're going to say, no, it was a field of an oved kochavim who also left over gifts for poor people, which shows, right? Even Gentiles, as much as they talk about the Gentiles are always trying to kill us, but apparently Gentiles also maybe left over. These also cared about the poor, and Liktinu Yisrael, and a Jew comes over and collects it. So now what it's trying to tell you is, Ta'ama dehifkir, halo ifkir chayab. So it would have to be that the Gentile made the field hefker, right? Halo ifkir, if not, you'd be obligated. And then what do you see here? That if he didn't make the field ownerless, then you'd have to do it. And then what are we saying here? That a Gentile's field is obligated, you're obligated to tithe. There are situations where you're obligated to tithe, even though this one says not. Right? But it says you are if, right? Unless you're exempt, right? Chayavim b'maser, unless he was mafkir. So you are obligated in maser on a Gentile's produce. To which, and that's Rabba's proof. Comes the Gemara and says, no, what are you talking about? No, go back to case one. This isn't a Gentile's property. The Jew came and is chayav and maser because he took it from a Gentile. No. You're talking about a Yisrael. And the Gentile really did collect the leket shechan peah. Now, what was the problem? You already, the first Jew, right, the original Jew who owned the field already made it ownerless. So you can't say it depends on whether or not they make it ownerless. That's the whole definition. I have an answer for you, the Gemara says. Very interesting. What does it mean to make it ownerless? To make it ownerless was they made it ownerless for the person's fellow Jews, not necessarily also for Gentiles. They had in their mind that I'm leaving this for Jewish people. So if the Gentile takes it now, what does it mean? Unless the Jew specifically said, I'm making this ownerless for all the people in my city or for all the people anywhere. And then in that case, then you won't be obligated maser. I forgot to mention the most important part here. Sorry. Any leket shechan peah, if I'm a Jew and I collect leket shechan peah, I'm not obligated to tithe the produce. It's exempt. Okay. So this is the idea. I'm sorry. I missed the most important point. I don't know how it eluded me. But the whole idea here is that leket shechan peah are exempt from maser. So what it's saying here is, why is it exempt? Because anything that's ownerless is exempt from maser. If I make all my produce ownerless, then no one needs to take truma maser. So therefore, again, let's just go through quickly. So if, right, the whole thing is it's exempt because I made it ownerless, right? The question was, well, why? Already by definition, it should have been ownerless. And then the Gemara said, it's that I made it ownerless, though, only for Jews. And if I specifically make it ownerless for everybody, then it'll be exempt from master, even if a Gentile took it. So the first, if I don't make it ownerless for everybody and a Gentile picks it up, it's not ownerless as far as he's concerned. So therefore, I still, right, it doesn't have that exemption of the Trumot and the Maschal. So if that Gentile sells it to a Jew, then they'll actually have to take Trumot and Maschal on it because I never made it ownerless. Okay, that's the whole idea here. Okay, so now that was Rabba's attempt to prove, but the Gemara rejected it because it has nothing to do with what we thought, which was land that was owned by a Gentile, because it's not talking about land owned by a Gentile. Tashma, let's learn from this source now a proof for Rabbi Elazar. Yisrael shalakach sedem yoveh kochavim. So a Jew purchases a field from Ovei Kochavim, ad shelo hivia shlish. Okay, this means if the land didn't yet reach a third of its growth when he sold it. So now, chazar umecharalo mishevia shlish. So again, I purchased it from the Gentile before it reached a third. Then I sold it back to him after it already reached a third. Chayevet b'maser shekvar nitchayva. What's a third? A third is that we see this in Shabbat, by the way, ma'achal and drosai. If it's cooked a third of the way, also if crops grow a third of the way, that's the main part. Okay, that's the most important part. So now they say, if I owned it when it got to a third, when it was nitchayva and maser, that already kind of puts it in the world of maser because it grew in my domain, then you'd be obligated to maser. So from here you can write, meaning I sold it to the Gentile after it was a third, and then the Gentile sold it back to you, and then you made the pile, did the Gemara Malacha, you'd be obligated. But that's only because par nitchayva. Nitchayva in lo, nitchayva lo. But if it was in the Gentile's possession, when it reached a third, then no. Now, what do you see here? Yesh koach, right? There is a kinyan for a non-Jew to basically override kedushat shvi. If it was in their possession, it sounds from here like it would be obligated in the maser. If it was in their possession when it reached a third, and then later sold it to me, even if I do the pile, I'm not liable enough to take the maser. So in order to reject this as a proof for Rabbi Elazar, they answer, this is talking about Syria, Syria, which has a different status than Israel. It's kind of in between. Why? Who conquered Syria as part of Israel? David. When King David expanded the borders, King David basically expands the borders to include Syria. That has somewhat sanctification, but on a rabbinic level, not on, because according to this opinion, the kibush of an individual, as opposed to when the Jews came in the times of Joshua, that was the conquering of the many, right? And that was what we were commanded to do. Any expansion that King David did is only on a rabbinic level obligated. And that's why in this case, it's only going to be if it was in the hands of the Jew when it got to a third. But if we're talking about Israel, it would be a different story, at least possibly. It's a possible explanation, in which case you can't learn anything from this source. We're going to do the same thing with the next source. Tashma. We jointly own a field, me and a Gentile, or you and a Gentile. Now turning to Amud Bet. Tevel v'chulim u'ravim zebazeh. That means every single grain of wheat, half of it is tevel, needs truma masra to be taken, half of it does not. Divrei Rebbe, that's what Rebbe says. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees and says, Omer shalovei kochavim patur shel Yisrael chayav. When we divide up the produce 50-50, the Gentiles, not obligated produce, yours or mine or whoever's it is obligated in the tithes. So now, what do you notice about this machloket? Well, nobody disagrees on what. Ad kan lo pligi ela demar savar yesh brer or mar savar ein brer. Aval de kule alma yesh kinyan lo bei kochavim be'eretz Yisrael ki b'yam ma'asil. Let's just start with the end part. Everyone agrees that, in theory, the Gentiles' produce does not need truma masra. Everyone agrees with that. The question only is, do we hold by brera or not? Remember, retroactive designation, we always come back to this topic. It's a real favorite, which is what? When we divide up the property, 5 months in, everything grows, we gather all our produce and split it 50-50. can we say that from the beginning, the Gentiles was the Gentiles and mine is mine? That's the second opinion of Rashbam. He basically says, so therefore, all of the produce that ends up in the Gentiles was as if it was the Gentiles from the beginning. So there was never an obligation to tithe them, even though there was, obviously. But once we split it, we can retroactively say, oh, from the beginning, this really was yours. And from the beginning, this was really mine, and therefore mine is obligated to tithe. Rebbe says you can't do breira. So therefore, every grain is half-half. And then, right, you have to deal with, doing Truma Masrot on everything, even the part that ends up in the hands of the Gentile. So anyway, the point is that everyone agrees, though, that there's no maser on their stuff. It's just a matter they might have to anyway, because it's every grain is half-half. But that's only because of breira. But there really is no obligation. So that would seem that there is kinyan lafkiam ya maser, just like Rabbi Elazar said. And as I said, we're going to reject it in the same way. So again, we're going to say maybe this is all in Syria and not in Israel, where it's only rabbinic, and therefore we can be more lenient. Third source, and now we're going to finally get back to our Mishnah. As I said, we're kind of on a tangent, and now we're going to connect it to our Mishnah. Why don't we learn from here? Now I'm just going to stick with Rashi's interpretation. You can also, there's also a way to explain this according to the others, but we'll just keep it simple here. So you sold your field to a Gentile. You are now obligated to buy all the bikurim back because of tikkun olam. Now, what's the obvious inference? Mipnei tikkun olam in midoraita lo. Only because of tikkun olam, which overrides the Torah law, right? The Torah law would then be that I don't need to take bikurim. The bikurim aren't, like they're not sanctified anymore. So why would I be taking bikurim if once the Gentile buys it, it removes me from all, again, if it removes you from tithes, it obviously also removes you from bikurim. So Amar Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi comes up with what I like to call the very creative interpretation, now you'll see, of what exactly happened here. He creates a whole historical answer to what exactly happened. There were two different ordinances instituted at different points in history, basically based on the needs and what was going on, a reaction to what the people were doing. In the beginning, they would bring bikurim by Torah law, because the whole point that Rav Ashi is trying to say is, you can also read this according to Rabba, that really they were obligated to bring the bikurim even by Torah law, meaning it didn't take away any of the sanctity. It was still there. But what happened? I'll stop here for a minute, even though I'm mid-sentence. What happened was people said, oh, well, if it doesn't remove the sanctity, then I can sell my field. And then first they just talked about the basic Torah law is if you do this, but they didn't really think people were going to do this. But then they saw that people said, well, you know what? To sell my land to a Gentile is not such a big deal, because anyway, the sanctity is still there. And anyway, I take the bikurim from it. So what's the big deal? I'll sell it to a Gentile. In other words, again, what's the problem with selling to a Gentile? That you're now removing the sanctity from this land, that we believe the land is sanctified, and now we're not keeping the mitzvot on the land. Well, if anyway, we'll keep the mitzvot on the land, it's not such a big deal, and we'll sell our land to Gentiles. So then what happened? Well, the kinu lehu de lo laitu, they still didn't want people selling land to Gentiles. They wanted Jews to settle the land. So they said, don't bring bikurim, even though you're supposed to, right? Again, we've seen tikkun olam that kind of goes against the Torah law. Don't bring the bikurim. Why? Because they wanted people to think you're removing the sanctity from the land, and therefore people would be discouraged from selling land to Gentiles. But what happened? Well, then, now in the beginning, if you were poor, you wouldn't necessarily sell your land to a Gentile, because you were still going to have to take the bikurim, and you'd have to pay a lot of money for that. So what did they do? They said, and now again, that was just, at this point, the poor people actually say, oh, better to sell to Gentiles. I'll sell to them. It's probably easier to sell to them. Or let's say there were less Jews around that were interested in buying land. So they sold to Gentiles because they were desperate for money, and they didn't have to pay the bikurim, so there was no disincentive here. So hadar tekinu lehu delete. So then, in order to deal with this new trend that had developed, this is, by the way, this goes on all the time, right? They do one thing, it causes a new trend. So basically, because of the new trend, people now, right, were selling land and happy that they didn't have to bring the bikurim, so they were doing this a lot. We said, oh, wait, No more. You have to bring the bikurim in order to deter the poor people from selling their land to the Gentiles. So that explains, again, in a very convoluted way, explains this takana and the different stages it had in order to basically make our Mishnah fit with Rabba's approach. Itmar. Now we're going to get into a machlok between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which is going to take us to the end of the daf and into tomorrow's. Hamocher sadeu lepelot. If we're already on the topic of bikurim, and now we're not talking about Gentiles anymore, but I sell my land to a Jew for produce. I sell you my land so you can have the produce, but I don't sell you the land itself. I just sell you the rights to have the produce from my land for whatever a number of years. Rabbi Yochanan Amar meviva kore. So you bring the bikurim because you bought it from me, and you read the text that goes along with it, which is the whole text. We say most of it, not all of it, at the Seder. Arami Oved Avi comes up in Dvarim chapter 26. At the end of that section, you say, and now you brought us to the land, and I am going to bring my from my land that you gave me. And, right, God, this came from you. But now I don't own this land. So what does it mean that you gave me? You didn't give it to me. I don't own it. I only own the produce. I don't own the land. So Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't matter. You still read the text. Reish Lakish Amar meviva eino kore. And this happens to a whole bunch of characters. We're not going to talk about who, but there's all sorts of situations where you bring the bikurim, you do the action, but you don't read the text because the text is not relevant to you. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar meviva kore. Kinyan perot ki kinyan aguf dami. So Rabbi Yochanan says you bring and you read the bikurim. Why? Because acquiring the produce is kind of like you acquire the property, even though you didn't, but it's considered like you did. So therefore you could say that you gave me. Reish Lakish Amar meviva eino kore. Kinyan perot lav ki kinyan aguf dami. This is what he means. Produce is produce, not land. You didn't get the land. The land is not yours. So therefore you can't read the text. So now we're going to have a slew of questions. First one, we're going to resolve, and then have a different version, which is the exact opposite. Okay, the mirror image sugya. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan brings the following sources of question against Reish Lakish. The pasuk says, when you bring the bikurim, it says you should be happy v'samachta b'chol hatov with all the good that God gave you. U'liveitecha. Okay, and to your house. So what are they darshan with your house? Often your house is a reference to the wife. So liveitecha melamed she'adam mevi bikurei ishto b'korei. Means you can bring the produce of your wife. Now remember, what rights does the husband have to the land of the wife? Only produce, not the goof. It's the exact same situation. So it says here, Adam mevi bikurei ishto b'korei. So Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, you say it's not kinyan aguf, and you can't say the text, but look, the husband can say the text to the wife. To which Reish Lakish says very wisely, he seems to be the smart guy on today's talk, it's a special drasha there. The drasha is to tell you, normally this wouldn't be the case. Specifically here, you have a drasha to tell you, yes, it is. This is an exception to the rule, which proves that the rule is the opposite. Because if you need an exception, it must be the rule is not that way. So that proves my point. Some people say that Reish Lakish brought this as a question based on what we just said against Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan. Uleveitecha comes to teach you what? That's your proof. Here, because it says leveitecha, you bring your wife's produce. But ba'alma, you wouldn't. But normally, if you don't own the land, you wouldn't do it. Amar le, to which Rabbi Yochanan responds in the same way we did just before. Tama didi nami mehacha kamina. That's my proof. This is a paradigm. This isn't an exception. This is the paradigm that from here we learn that even if you don't own it, this proves my point. So again, it's all a matter of how you look at it. Another difficulty. Now this seems to not go with what we just said, that it's an exception. Okay, but you're going on the way, you have your wife's produce in your hands. While you're on the way bringing your wife's stuff, you hear your wife die. Maybe you continue to bring and you say the text. Now, what can you infer from here? Meita'in lo meita lo. It sounds like if she didn't die, you wouldn't be able to read the text. Only because you heard she died can you bring the text. This seems to say even your wife, right? Again, you have to ignore the drasha we just saw. Even your wife, since because you don't have rights to the stuff, unless she dies, then right now what happens when she dies? It all goes to you. You inherit her stuff. So so now here comes. So that seems to prove, right? Reish Lakish. If you don't have rights to the fruit, to the ground, to the land, you don't say it because meita'in lo meita lo. But if she didn't die, you wouldn't say it. To which Rabbi Yochanan answers, Hu adin da'af agav de lo meta. No, it would be true even if she didn't die. So then why did you have to give this case of meta? Meta itzri chale. You might have thought, normally you bring your wife stuff, of course you read. But you might have thought that if she dies in the middle, maybe you don't. Why? Because there's a change of ownership in the middle there. And now why would you think that would be an issue? Well, you might have applied what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Hanina said to this case. And that's why it's going to teach you, no, you don't. What did Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Hanina say? Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Hanina, you take your fruits and then you give it to a shaliach to bring your bikurim. And the messenger dies in the middle. So you bring your own bikurim, but you don't say the text. Why? The psukim say velakachta, you take them, and then it says veheveta, and you bring them, which means you need the person who takes them, and the person who brings them is going to be the same. And it's not the same here, because he did the velakachta, you did the veheveta. So it has to be all done by the same person. So you might think here, when the husband did it for his wife, and then the wife died in the middle, and now all of a sudden the ownership changed in the middle, he became the owner of the land. Maybe in that case would be an exception to the rule, and maybe he wouldn't be able to say it. Kamash malan, that's why it comes to teach you that even if she dies on the way and there's this switch of ownership, he still reads the text. And even if he brings it all the way and she doesn't die, he would also read the text. And then that would be not any question to what Rabbi Yochanan said. Okay, so with that, we finish our sugya. Let's just do a quick review of our daf. We started with the selling yourself to a Gentile. We brought two stories, one where they wouldn't redeem him because he really left the religion, and the other, Reish Lakish, who saved himself from these Gentiles. Then we got to the story of, the Mishnah of selling to Gentiles. You have to buy back the bikurim, again, according at least to Rashi. And then we brought this machlok at Rabba, Rabbi Elazar. We tried to bring proofs for each side. One proof for Rabbi, he brought himself, but the Gemara rejected it. Then the Gemara brought three proofs for Rabbi Elazar, the last one being our Mishnah, but then said it doesn't prove anything because Ravashi comes up with a creative way to read it. And the other two sources we said were about Syria, which basically doesn't have Trumon Masrot on a Torah level, and that's why, and it really can't prove Rabbi Elazar. And then we went to this selling your field for the produce. So since you don't own the land, maybe you can't say the Mikra Bikurim, or maybe you can according to Rabbi Yochanan anyway, because it's like you own the land. And then again, we had back and forth, bringing sources to try to prove or disprove, right? In the first part of our daf, it was all bringing sources to prove. In this case, it was bringing sources to disprove, which obviously is really one and the same. If it disproves one, it proves the other. So, but it's kind of brought in a different method of an ATV, which is a difficulty, rather than trying to say, here's a proof. That's it for today. We'll meet up tomorrow. And as I said, the Zoom will not continue from Tuesday to Tuesday, but we still have Zoom tomorrow morning. See you then.